Hi guys, Gordon McKee is the Labour MP for Glasgow South. Now, he also has an online presence where he puts out explainer videos using everyday items, which is really interesting and well put together. He uses it to talk about tax, to talk about government policy, and on this occasion, debt. But unfortunately, there's a massive problem with what he's saying here. Have a listen.
There's a reason Britain feels broke, and it's probably not what you think. I'm going to explain, but first of all, you need to understand one thing. It's called debt to GDP ratio. Sounds boring, kind of is boring, but it's important. Basically means how much debt the government has compared to how rich the country is. When I was born in 1994, it was about 30%. In other words, for every pound the country made, the government owed 30p in debt. And it stayed that way until around about 2008, when the banks ran out of money and we had to bail them out. So then, debt jumps to 60%. Over the next 10 years of Tory government, it rises to about 80%. Then some guy eats a bat in Wuhan, and now nobody can go to work. So the government has to borrow even more money. And today, Britain's debt to GDP ratio is roughly 100%. But the weirdest thing is that's not even the main problem. Because in France, the debt to GDP ratio is 113%. In America, it's 120%. Japan's 240%. What's really mad is that Britain is paying more interest on its debt than any of these countries because the people lending money to the government aren't just looking at the total amount of debt, but how quickly it's racking up. Think of it like this. Japan is your mate who's always in his overdraft. America's the guy who spends a lot but always shows up to work. Britain was the sensible one, but we've bought a dog, a new car, and a hair transplant all in 1 month. We've pretended that we've had a big pay increase, but in reality, we've just got a credit card with a lot of debt. So the people who loan the government money are starting to charge a lot more for it. We're now in the crazy position where 8% of all of the money the government spends is just servicing debt. That's more than double the entire defence budget. And if you're spending more servicing your debt than you are defending your country, that is not good. If you want to know what I think we should do about that, then follow me for part 2.
Okay. As I mentioned, there's a bit of a problem with this video. So what he said here seems to be quite reasonable on the surface. But he's forgetting the value of debt. Now, what do I mean by that? Debt should be used to invest. So imagine a situation, you have a small business. You're a baker or you run a pastry shop and you sell to the public. And then you decide, what I'd like to do is I'd like to do deliveries, but I don't have a van. So what I'll do is I'll borrow money from the bank and use this money to buy a van. So now you have a significant amount of debt because you have a van that you had to buy. But what is that van doing? It's allowing you to do deliveries. So you're able to make more money as a result of that purchase. But if you're only focusing on the debt, then of course you're thinking, well, this is a disaster because your debt has increased. But you're not focusing on the investment. That's what is so important and what's missing from this video. Debt is not a problem if you're investing it. Now, when it comes to the UK economy, unfortunately, there has been a lack of investment over the last 20 years. So there's been a lot of borrowing, but not a lot of investment. Now, when it comes to government services, and I mentioned this before, like the NHS or education or infrastructure, a lot of this money is going into the private sector. It's not being used to reinvest once again in the public service, in the infrastructure, in whatever. So it's a bit like with your pastry business, instead of actually buying a van, you decide to use the money to go on holiday. Yes, somebody's going to benefit, the hotelier or the travel agent, but it's not good for your business. So what you need to do is stop that and instead spend that money on something that will help your business. Now, I'm using the idea of a business. It's not, and I've mentioned before, you can't compare it to the state, but this is what it's a bit like when it comes to debt. So the government getting into debt is not a problem as long as that money is used for capital investment, is used to improve the situation within society. So as we know, if the government invests in infrastructure, it can get a lot of that money back through more businesses setting up because of that infrastructure, because of improvements in that infrastructure. That's where you're going to see tax revenue increase. So governments have to get into debt. If they don't get into debt, then you're not going to see your economy thrive. You're not going to see it expand. So while the focus has been on, well, if the ratio to debt is low, that's a positive thing. In reality, it's not necessarily a positive thing. It's important where the debt is, where this money from the debt is going. Is it going into capital expenditure, investment, or is it just going into the private sector? Because if it's just going into the private sector, then you have a massive problem there. And as I've mentioned before, when Margaret Thatcher sold off all the public housing, the council houses through Right to Buy, and it wasn't replenished, then what happened was you had a situation where people needed housing, but they had to rely on the private sector to access that housing. And with house prices rising and more landlords asking for more and more money, you ended up with a situation where the government is taking money and giving that to the private sector, as opposed in the sense the landlords. This is a massive problem. That would have to stop. But if the government invest in infrastructure, invest in public services, then you don't end up in a situation like that. So while Gordon is correct with most of this video, he's left out the very important point that debt is not a problem if you're investing. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think, and I'll see you in the next video.